At this point in the course now, we learned about all the core features that make up Next.js, all the core benefits it has to offer, all the core features you need to know when you are working with Next.js in your own projects. And we did learn about all those concepts in theory with small demos and also with our events course project. In this course section, we're going to dive into yet another course project, a brand new project which we build from scratch, where we will again apply everything we learned from the ground up in one go, so in one complete project without any pauses or interruptions, and we're going to build a complete blog website. To be precise, this is what we're going to build. A blog website which you could deploy like that, and we are going to deploy it in the next course section, by the way. And this website has a starting page with some featured blog posts. And of course, we as the owner of this blog will be able to decide which posts should be featured. We'll then have a page with all the blog posts. We can dive into an individual blog post, and there we also support features like inline images, so images inside of the article, and inline code snippets, which are rendered in a good looking way. And we also will have a contact page with a form where visitors can contact us, and we'll use an API route to handle requests sent from that form to then store that contact data in a MongoDB database. Now, the blog posts will not be stored in that database. Instead, we'll use a language called Markdown for that to add Markdown files in a special folder of our project and write our blogs with Markdown to then render them out as HTML like we're doing it here. That is what we're going to build in this course section, a complete project, and by doing so, we will again practice all the things we learned, and we again will apply all the core features we had a look at throughout this course. Now, to get started with this complete blog, I have a brand new Next.js project where I just removed some of the initial pages, and you find this starting project attached again. It's a very simple project, not too complex, just has some starting code, some starting structure. And we're going to add our own code, our own components, our own pages, and our own styles step by step throughout this module. Now the question is, how do we get started with this project though? And there are different ways. It's of course up to you which approach you prefer, but I personally like to get started with my pages. That gives the project a general structure, and I can then plan my other components around those pages which we need. So I'll start in this pages folder. And here for this blog, we need a couple of pages. We need the starting page, which shows the featured blog posts and our little welcome screen. We need the contact page, which shows that form users can fill out. We need the page for all the blog posts. And we need the individual blog post page. And therefore, in the pages folder, I'll start with the starting page by adding an index.js file in the pages folder. Now, in there, we can create our homepage component function and export that as a default here, like this. Now I'll copy that basic code because I'll create functions in the same way in the other pages. For example, in the contact page, we also need that, and hence we can add a contact.js file here in the pages folder. Now you learned that the alternative would be to add a contact folder with an index.js file in there. It's up to you which approach you prefer. I will go for the contact.js file and just add my component in there, the contact page, like this. Then we also have our post-specific pages. And for that, I'll create a subfolder because there I'll also need a nested route with a dynamic segment. However, I'll start with a different page, a different route, and that's the all posts page. For this, we could add a posts folder and then an index.js file in there. And that page will then be loaded for requests targeting our domain /posts/nothing. So here we have the all posts page like this. Then we have the page for a single post. So when we click on a post, the page that shows that single post, and that page is dynamic. It should have a dynamic parameter in the URL which identifies that post, something like the post ID. And therefore we could add a ID.js file with ID in square brackets because you learned that this sets up a dynamic page in Next.js, which is loaded for different requests with different IDs in the URL. And we can then extract the concrete value that was provided for a given request from inside that page. That would work, but I don't want to work with an ID here. Now, of course, the identifier name here is totally up to you, but you should name it such that it reflects which kind of value you'll extract. And I don't want an ID here, because if we had an ID, if we do that for a second, then we would load a single post for something like /posts/p1, p2, p3, and so on, if p1, p2, p3 are our IDs. And whilst this would work, it's not very human readable and also not search engine friendly. It would be better to have URLs like /posts/getting-started with Next.js if our URLs would look something like this. Now this thing here is called a slug. That's what we typically call a slug. It's also a unique identifier. We could call it a unique ID therefore, but it is called a slug, and it's basically a human readable sentence without white space, without special characters, simply with words separated by dashes. And hence here, I want to extract such a slug from my URL, and I expect that I do get these slug identifiers for the individual posts to have these human readable and search engine friendly URLs in the end. And that is then the single post page or the post detail page, however you want to call it. Now these are the 4 main pages which this project needs. Of course, definitely feel free to add more pages. It's also your project after all, and you can enhance it however you want, but these are the 4 pages with which I want to get started in this project here. So now we added those 4 pages. It's now time to start filling them with some life, and it's of course up to you with which page you want to start. Now I'll start very classic with the starting page, with the home page here, and I'll start populating that page. And on this home page, I want to do 2 things. I want to output 2 things. The first thing that should be rendered is like a hero section. And that's just how we typically call that. It's this welcome section where we present our main product, or in the case of a blog, maybe ourselves. So that's this hero section where we present ourselves. And then the second part is the featured posts section. Now we have no posts yet, but we can still start working on that and just output some dummy content for the moment, and we'll then replace the dummy content with actual posts once we have some. So these are the 2 kinds of things I want to output here, and therefore in the component where we return JSX, I want to have 2 main sections that will be output here. Now I want to keep my page component relatively lean and not put too much markup in here. I also don't want to add a styling file for the page component. That is something you don't have to do, but something you will often see. That page components are relatively lean, focus on getting data with getStaticProps if they need to, something we will add later, and don't do too much regarding styling or HTML. Instead, we use separate React components for that, and we then just use those separate React components here. So in the homepage component, we could want to output a hero component side by side to a featured posts component. And of course, we would need to wrap this with a fragment. So with this fragment component provided by React, since we're not allowed to have adjacent JSX elements otherwise. Now, of course, such a hero and featured posts component doesn't exist yet, and hence it's now our job to create it. And therefore, I'll add a brand new components folder on the root project level, so side by side to the pages folder. And the goal of this folder is to store all the individual components that will be used in this project. And in here, I'll add a new folder, the home page folder, because I want to store the homepage specific components in there. You can, of course, name this folder however you want though. But I'll create that homepage folder in the components folder, and inside of that homepage folder, I'll add two components, the hero component and this featured posts component. Now, both components will also need some styling. And since this is still no CSS course, and I don't want to bore you with writing CSS styles, you find styling files attached. Attached you find two CSS files, featured posts.module.css and hero module.css, and you should just download those two CSS files and add them in that homepage folder in the components folder side by side to these two JavaScript files, because we're going to use these styles. Now, of course, you are free to bring your own styles and tweak everything in the way you want. These are just some basic styles which we can use so that we don't have to write our own styles. Now, one important word about those styles though, in those files, I'm using a feature called CSS variables. I'm extracting certain values like colors, but also sizes and dimensions from CSS variables. And these CSS variables are defined in the globals CSS file, which I gave you right from the start, so which was part of the starting project you found in the last lectures. And the interesting thing about CS modules is that we now have one place where we can define and manage our colors and our sizes. And when we change it here, it will affect the entire application. Now, this is totally independent from Next.js. This is a default CSS feature. I'm just using it here, and I want to make you aware of that in case you look into my CSS files and wonder what these strange things are. Now, that means that, of course, you can also easily tweak your dimensions and colors by simply changing the values in the globals CSS file. But with that out of the way, let's go to the hero.js file and let's start working on that, and let's build that hero component. In that hero.js file, we want to build this hero component. So this welcome component on the starting page where we present ourselves. And therefore, I'll of course create a functional component again and export that just as we always did it throughout this course. And now in this hero component, I want to return a section, so the standard section element. And in that section, I then want to have a couple of different elements. I want to have an image where I show myself. I want to have some text where I say, "Hi, I'm Max," and some text below that where I introduce myself and write a couple of words about what this blog is about. Now I'll wrap the image in a div for styling purposes, and we're going to add the actual image in a second. Below that div, I then want to have a h1 tag where I say, "Hi, I'm Max," and of course plug in your name here. And then below that, a paragraph where I say something like, "I blog about web development," especially front-end frameworks like Angular or React, something like this. Of course, feel free to fine-tune this with your own texts and later also with your own image. Now we need some styling here, and for that we added this hero module CSS file, and therefore to apply it we should import our classes from that file. Since we are using a .module.css file, we are using CSS modules, which means that the classes defined in that file will be transformed behind the scenes such that the styles effectively are scoped to this component and don't spill over to other components, even if we use the same elements and class names there. That's a pretty nice feature, and that's why we're using it here. We have used it throughout this course already, though. Now, which classes should be applied? Well, on this section, you'd want to add a class of hero, which is simply one of the classes defined in the CSS file. On that image div, I'll add a class of image. And I don't have any classes on the h1 and paragraph elements because these will be styled with nested selectors inside of that CSS file. Okay, so now we got this. Now for the image, I want to use the next image component so that we get this automatically optimized image, which is automatically reduced in size and where different images are then loaded for different devices possibly, and which is also lazy loaded. And therefore we can import the image component from next image, and of course import should start with a lowercase I, and then we can use this image component here inside of this image div. Now this image component needs a couple of attributes, a couple of props. It needs to know its source, so a path to the image that should be loaded, a path to the base image, which is then automatically optimized and transformed by Next, a alt text, where I will simply say an image showing max, because I will soon add an image that shows myself, and then a width and a height. And here you should kind of calculate and estimate which width and height you will need for your image. Now, regarding the image file, you find an example image attached, which you can use. But of course, you can also bring your own image. You don't have to use the one you find attached. Attached, you, however, find a max PNG file, and you can drag and drop that into that public folder of your project. Though there, I will actually create a subfolder, images, and in there, I'll create another subfolder, site, and I'll then drag this max PNG file into that site folder. Now, I'll do that because soon I will have another folder inside of images, side by side to the site folder, with the images for the blog posts. That's why I have the separate site subfolder for images that belong to the site, but not to the blog posts. For the moment, of course, it's the only image we have, though, and now we want to point at it with our image component. So therefore, source here should be a path to that image. Now you learned that the path you construct here is ignoring the fact that the image lives in the public folder, because content from the public folder is exposed on the root level of the running website in the end. So you don't need to dive into public here. You shouldn't dive into public here. Instead, this path can start on your root level and then just directly dive into images, and then into site, and then in my case point at max PNG, since that's the image file. Now, since we're using the next image component, we also should define the width and height we want here, since that is required by next image to produce the optimized images, because it will then automatically shrink the base image, which might be much bigger, to that width and height. And it will also reduce the quality and much more. And here, a width and height of roughly 300 pixels should work. We can then still override the actual size of the image with CSS, by targeting it with certain CSS rules and changing width and height. But of course, the width and height you use here should be close to the actual width and height you then render on the screen, since otherwise you just waste size. If you load a pretty big image here, and then you would use CSS code to render it with 100 pixels width and height, then you would just load a too big image, even though you don't need it. On the other hand, if you load a too small image and you then use CSS to render a large image, it would also be bad, because then you would lose quality. That's why you want to get close to the actual image you need. And the image component is pretty flexible, and in case your image can have different sizes depending on the screen size and so on, you can always dive into the Next Image article to learn about different ways of configuring the image. Specifically the layout prop, which also allows you to define an image which can scale up and down with the viewport, with the responsive layout. By default, the image will have a layout of intrinsic, and that will scale the image down to smaller viewports but not up for bigger viewports. So it will not produce any bigger images than the width and height we set here. And that will make sense for this application for the way we use the image here. So long story short, with that we set up the image with a certain width and height. We got our other content, and now we want to use that hero component on the starting page. Now I am already rendering it here. Now we just need to import it. So we import hero from, and then let's go up one level, dive into components, homepage, hero, to import this component into the homepage. And I'll then get rid of the featured posts for the moment, since we haven't populated that component yet. With that, if we now run our development server with npm run dev, we can visit localhost 3000 and we should see this on the screen. This is this hero section with the styles I provided to you, with the image I provided to you, or with your own image if you brought your own image. And that's looking good, that's working. Now let's take the next steps and let's continue working on this website. So we got our hero component here, it's looking good, hopefully. And now we also need featured posts for this starting page. Now what we'll also need besides featured posts though is like a navigation bar at the top. Because at the moment we only have one working page with not too much content on it arguably, but later we will have other pages as well. The all posts page and the contact page. So therefore, to be able to reach that, we want to add some navigation. And hence, that is something I'll do first before we then come back to the featured posts. I want to add a navigation bar, or to be precise, I want to add a general layout. Because the navigation bar, which should be shown at the top, will not only be needed on the home page. Instead, we will need it on all pages. And that can be solved with a layout, as you learned throughout the course. We can utilize this _app.js file here to wrap the component which is rendered there, which is actually just the page content that was loaded for the different URLs, with a general layout. That is what we can do and what we typically want to do in Next.js applications. And therefore, let's build such a layout component. For that, in the components folder, we can create a new subfolder called layout. And in there, I want to add a couple of components that help us create layouts. The first one will be the layout component itself, a layout.js file. But then I'll add two other files as well, since I want to split my layout into multiple subcomponents. For example, I want to have a separate component that holds the actual navigation bar. So I'll name this main navigation. This will be my navigation component. And that navigation component should also render some logo for my blog, and therefore I'll create a separate logo component. And of course, you can split and mix and match and compose your components just as you need to. This is just some example split which I came up with, which works for me. If it doesn't work for you, if you want to split it in a more granular way or have bigger components, so less splits, that's of course also fine. You just need to adjust the styles then. Now with that, let's start with the layout component. In there, we can again create a function and export that function layout. And in that function, we then return a fragment because I want to have two adjacent JSX elements. And the first one will be the main navigation, so this separate component, which will store in the main navigation file. The second JSX element will be the regular main HTML element in which I want to output props.children. And for this, of course, we need to make sure that we accept props here. Props children, because we will wrap this layout component around this component here in the _app.js file. We can actually already do that here. In this file, we can already import layout from, and then go up one level, dive into the components folder, into the layout folder and the layout file, and then just wrap component with layout. So create layout here and wrap it around this component. Now it's this component which will be used as children or as a child inside of the layout component, so here. So that's step number one. Now I'm using the main navigation here, and hence I also already want to import main navigation from that main navigation JavaScript file. That file, however, is completely empty right now, and that needs to change therefore. So if we go to the main navigation file here, we of course again want to create a main navigation function and then export that as a default, as we always do it. And now inside that main navigation component, I want to return a header element, and then there as a first element my logo, and side by side to that a nav bar with a list of nav items. So here I'll add an unordered list with my list items, where in the list items I have my links. Now for the links, we will not use the standard anchor tag, because that would be handled by the browser only, and when we click it, we would load a brand new page and send a brand new request. Instead, we want to use Next's link component to take advantage of automatic data prefetching, which it does for us, and to take advantage of the fact that we stay in a single page application once the page was loaded initially. So therefore, we want to import link from Next link like this, like we did it many times before in this course, and then just output link here. So create a link here. Now the link needs a ref attribute where we point at /posts, for example, and load the posts page. And it has to be /posts because of our page structure. We have the posts folder with the index.js file, which should be loaded when we want to load all posts. And you learned before in this course that this structure in the pages folder leads to a /posts route, which is inferred by Next.js. So we want to link to that route here. Now that's not the only link though. I also want to have a link to my contact page, because we also have this contact.js file. And that file will be translated to a /contact route, as you learned. So we also want to have a /contact route here. So now we got that. I actually also want to make the logo clickable so that when we click the logo, we're taken back to the starting page. That's a quite common pattern on websites. And therefore, we also wrap the logo with a link like this and give this a ref of just / to go back to the starting page. Now you might remember that there was this special behavior of link when the child you passed to it was not plain text. If you pass your own component or any other HTML content to a link, link will not render an anchor tag by default. It only does that if you just pass plain text to it. If you pass anything else than plain text, the link will not render an anchor tag for you. So in order to get that, you should then bring your own anchor tag, like this. You don't need to add ref on that anchor tag. Link will do that for you. It will pass the ref set on link to the direct child of link, which is an anchor tag now. So it will do that for you, but you have to add the anchor tag element to tell link that it should render an anchor tag. This is not a bug or some inconsistency, but this exists. This feature exists to make sure that you can turn any element into a link, a div, a button, whatever you want. But here we want the anchor tag still, so I will add my own anchor tag wrapped around my logo. And speaking of the logo, that's of course still missing. I just added this dummy JSX code here, but we are not importing it, and the logo.js file is also empty. And therefore, as a next step, we'll work on that, and we're then also going to add some styling. So let's continue working on our layout, the navigation, the logo, and for that, let's add some styling. Again, for this, attached, you find a couple of CSS files. You find a logo.module.css file and a main navigation.module.css file. And you should download those and add them in your layout folder next to the logo.js and main navigation.js file. Again, there I define some CSS styles for you, which you can of course tweak and override. And in the main navigation.js file, we can now utilize these CSS files. We can import classes from main-navigation.module.css to take advantage of CSS modules and import the classes that belong to this component from the CSS file. And then we can add them. For example, on the header, we should add a class name of classes.header, which sets up the styling for this header. And that is actually the only class we have to add in the main navigation component, because all the other selectors are just nested selectors then, so to say. That then allows us to work on the logo. We can already import it, so let's add an import to of logo from the logo file, and then let's work on that logo file a little bit. Now the logo component will be a fairly trivial component, again created and exported as we always do. We will need some styles in here, so we should import classes from logo.module.css. So this CSS file we just added. And then the logo here for me is a simple text-based logo. I'll just set up a div with a text of Max Next blog. Of course, again, use your name here. And then I'll add a class name here of classes.logo using one of the CSS classes or the only CSS class defined in here. That will style that logo. Now we add that logo to main navigation and we use main navigation in the layout. And layout is then wrapped around our rendered component in _app.js. So that should be everything now. And if we now go back to our page, we should see this header here, which blends into the hero section here on purpose, where we have the logo, which is clickable and takes us to the starting page. And then our two links here, which are also clickable, but we haven't added any content for those pages yet. So at the moment, they won't do anything. But that is now the layout added and the navigation added. And with that, let's come back to the starting page and complete it by adding the featured posts below the hero section here. So let's continue working on the featured posts now that we added the navigation and so on. The goal of the featured posts component is to output some posts which we, as the owner of the blog, marked as featured. Now, we will add posts and mark them as featured in a later step, but we can already start with outputting some dummy posts here for the moment. And therefore, in featured posts, I'll again create a basic component, featured posts, and you guessed it, we will export it like we always did. Now we have a featured posts module CSS file, and we will need it, so we'll import classes from that featured posts module CSS file already. And then here in that featured posts component, I again want to create another section which will receive a class of latest, because that's one of the classes I predefined in the CSS file. Then a heading for this section where I say featured posts. And then below that, a list of posts or a grid of posts. And for this, I'll actually create a separate component. Why? Because we will then use that same list or grid as it will actually be on the all posts page. On both the starting page in the featured posts component, as well as on the all posts page, I want to output posts in the same way. I want to render a grid of post cards, so of post items. I want to render those as a grid, and these items then should be clickable and take us to the individual post. The only difference is the number of posts and the actual posts that are being rendered. But the way they are presented will always be the same. Hence, we can create a reusable component for that, and that is what I will do. In the components folder, I'll create a new subfolder, which I'll name posts, which should hold all the post-specific components. And we could argue that featured posts is also a post-specific component, but it's even more specific to the homepage because we only use it there, which is why I keep it in the homepage folder. Now in that posts folder, I'll add a posts-grid component file though, which will then render this grid of posts. And now for that posts grid, you already find a posts grid module CSS file attached, which we will need in a second. So you can download that and add it in the posts grid JavaScript file. Now you also find attached a post item module CSS file, and you can download and add that as well, also in the posts folder, because we will also create a post item JS file next to that, which will hold a single post item. The post grid will render a couple of post items, and I'll split the grid and the actual items into separate components to keep every component lean and maintainable. Let's start working on the post grid component though. In that post grid file, I'll add a function, postgrid, which is my default component function, which as always is then just exported. Of course, by the way, you could create a snippet for this in Visual Studio Code to save some time. But here I'll just write it manually all the time. And then in the postgrid component, we want to return the JSX code. That should be output here. Now, the JSX code is again very simple here. It will be an unordered list of post items. Now, the data for those posts should be received from outside though. I do expect that I get props here, and in my props, I want to get a special posts prop. Now, of course, the prop name is up to you since it's your component. You just need to make sure that you then later use that prop name for passing data into this component. So then I want to output my posts dynamically here by mapping every post into a post item. And we have yet to add this component. But that's my goal here. I want to output a list of posts where I map my post data into post item components. That's the goal here. Now we will need to import post item for that from the post item file we just added. And this file is empty right now, but we will work on that soon. And we'll also need some styling, so I will import classes from /postgrid.module.css. And that is that PostScript CSS file for this component, which has a class which should be added to the unordered list. There, I want to add the grid class, which is defined in PostScript. And there we use the CSS grid feature to render some grid columns. Okay, so that's that. Now let's work on the post item, component, which outputs an individual item in that grid of posts. In this post item component, or in this file, we again create our component function, and as always, export that, of course. And then we define the structure, the markup of a single post item. And for me, a post item will be a list item, which should make sense because we're in an unordered list. So having a list item is a good choice typically. And then the entire item should be clickable. Therefore, I'll import link from next link, because of course I want to use this link to still stay in the single page application, use prefetching and all those things. And I'll then add a link here with an anchor tag inside, since I'll have a more complex HTML structure in that link. And as mentioned a couple of minutes ago, you then need to bring your own anchor tag to tell link that it should still render a anchor tag. And then regarding that more complex structure in here, I want to have a div which will hold a post image, which is at the top of this post card. And below that, another div which will hold the content, the title, the date, and a short excerpt which we want to show. Now inside that first div, I therefore output my image, and we will soon add the source and everything else. And in the second div here, there I'll add a h3 tag with the title of the post, then a time element which outputs the time, something like July 13th, 2022, something like that will be output here, and then a paragraph with the excerpt text of that post. And of course, at the moment, it's just dummy data. Soon it will be actual data. Now, before we continue on the data, let's continue with the styling actually. For this, I will again import classes from that post-item.module CSS file, which I provided to you in the last lecture. And then we add a class to the list item, the post class. We also add a class to the div which wraps the image. It's the image class. And we add a class to this div which wraps the content. It's the content class. Now let's work on the data. The data for a single post item, of course, is not hard-coded in the post item. We will also not fetch it from inside the post item with use effect and fetch or anything like that. Instead, I expect that I get it through props. So that in the post's grid component, where we render the post items and where we have a list of posts, which probably is a list of JavaScript objects with the post data, where we then just forward that data we have here already into the post item through props. That's the goal. So in post item, we can expect a couple of props. And I will use object destructuring to pull those properties into separate constants. Now it is your component. It is up to you how you expect to get data, how you expect to pass data to this component. If you want to have one prop which carries the entire post data or multiple props. And I will go for one prop here, a post prop on props, and I'll destructure that. So I expect that I get a post prop, and that post prop holds a JavaScript object with multiple properties which describe the post, and I'm now pulling out those properties into separate constants with object destructuring here. And we could, for example, expect a title, an image, an excerpt, which is a short summary text basically for the post, the date, and also the slug of that post. So the path to that post, so to say, the unique identifier of the post. And that's the data with which we can work down there. For example, for the title, we can now output the title, which we extract here. Now for the date, we can also output this, but I want to format it first, make it more human readable. Because the date which we get here as a prop will be in a more machine readable format. Also human readable, but not nicely formatted. And I want to make sure that it is nicely formatted. Hence here, I will actually create a formatted date constant where I create a new date object and pass my date prop to it so that a new date JavaScript object is constructed based on that date value which I receive here. And hence, of course, we have to make sure that date holds a value which can be used with this constructor function. And we will make sure that this is the case. And then on that date object, we can call toLocale datestring and pass enus as a first argument and a configuration object as a second argument to output a human readable date. And here I'll set day to numeric. I'll set month to long so that if it's January, we don't output 0, 1 or just 1, but instead January as a text. And then year to numeric as well. Okay, so now we got that formatted date, and it's now this formatted date which I want to use down here. So here we output the formatted date. Now for the exert, we want to output the, exert, which we're getting as a prop. So output exert here, this exert. And now for the image. The image needs a source property. It needs an alt text. And then we need to specify the width and the height. Now let's start with alt. The alt text could just be our title here. So I'll just use title. Now for width and height, I also prepared some values which should work. And that's 300 and 200 pixels roughly. That should produce good looking images. We will also sometimes have images which are a bit wider than 300 because here the image will actually scale in size as defined in CSS. The CSS code is such that the image will differ in size, but still will always produce good looking images with these settings. And it always will be a bit of tweaking and trial and error to find good settings here to get images which are as small as possible and still look good. But I'll come back to the image later because we will also need to add the layout property here later. But for the moment, let's keep it like this so that we then also see why we will need to add it. For the moment, let's focus on the source instead. What is the source? Well, we get an image here, but the image which we get will actually just be the image file name. So we need to construct a full image path first, because the file name is not enough. And I'll do this with a template literal, so with backticks. And we will start with a hard-coded string of /images/posts. Now that's important. At the moment, in the public images folder, we have no posts folder. I'll change this now and I'll add one. This folder is empty right now, but it will very soon contain some images. So it's this folder which will hold images for individual posts. And that's therefore the start of this image path. Then I want to have a subfolder in that posts folder for every post which we add. And that subfolder should have the unique identifier of that post as a name. So that's slug. Hence, the next segment here is the slug. We'll dive into a subfolder of that slug. So with that slug as a name in that images posts folder. And then in there, we look for the actual image file like this. That's my image path. And therefore now that is what I'll set here as a source. Okay, so that is now this post item component here. For image to work, we, however, still need to import this image component from Next image. But now we got this set up. Now we can connect this to our posts grid and then start adding some dummy data so that we do see some output. So let's now start wiring up our post item to the post grid, and let's add some dummy data. To wire it up, keep in mind that in the posts grid we get posts through props, and that will probably be an array full of objects that describe a post. So the assumption is that an individual post in that list has all the data post item needs. We can make that assumption because we are writing that code. So we'll just have to make sure that this is the case later. Now post item, this component, wants a post prop. Hence now in posts grid, we can add that post prop here and pass the post, which we get here in this map method, into post item through that post prop. Now we expose that data to post item. Now since we map, we should also add the key prop. That's required by React.js to efficiently render and update that list. And we can set this to some unique identifier, and every post will have a slug property, which is the unique identifier of a given post, and therefore that is what we can use here. Now we got that, now we need some dummy data. For this, let's first of all go to featured posts in the homepage folder, because that is where we now want to use that posts grid. So in here, we want to output posts grid. And for this, you should make sure that you add the import to posts grid to that component. And now there, we need to set the posts prop on post grid. We need to set that because in the posts grid component, we are extracting that posts prop here. So we want to set this, and in featured posts, I actually also expect that I get my posts data through props. Now that's a long chain of props, and we could therefore of course also kind of consider using context or Redux to avoid this prop drilling. But here I'm actually fine with it because it is a chain that makes a lot of sense. And posts grid, for example, shouldn't be tied to one specific context anyways, because we will reuse that component in different places. So that should definitely receive its data through props instead of context. And hence I'll leave it like this. Therefore, in featured posts, I'll set the posts prop on posts grid to props.posts. And yeah, that's a lot of posts, but that is what this application is about in the end. So now featured posts also has a posts prop that needs to be populated. And let's therefore now finally go to the place where the prop chain will end, and that is the index.js file in the pages folder. Here below hero, I want to output my featured posts, and therefore you need to make sure that you do add that import to import the featured posts component. And here we now set our posts prop. Now later, we will get posts with get static props when we have actual posts which we load. For the moment, we don't have that. For the moment, to just see something, I'll add a dummy posts array here, which I'll set as a value for the posts prop, and will then replace that later. Now, dummy posts will be an array full of dummy post data, so full of dummy post objects. And now every post object here should in the end have these properties, because that's what we rely on later. We want to have a title, image, excerpt, date, and slug. Hence here in index.js, we want to add that. We want to add a slug, a title, an image, an excerpt, and our date. So all those properties we are relying on here in post item. 5 props there, 5 properties here. Now, since it's dummy data, we can come up with any slug and any values in general we want. The slug should be a text with the words separated by dashes and no special characters. So here I'll have like a slug of getting started, with Next.js, and then I'll add a title of getting started with Next.js. So that could be a blog post title. Then an image, which I'll name getting started Next.js, just like this. And then also .png. I will soon provide this file to you so that we have this image. Then add an excerpt where I say something like, Next.js is the React framework for production. It makes building full stack React apps and sites a breeze and ships with built-in server-side rendering. Now you can come up with any text you want. It just shouldn't be too long because it's just a short preview text in the end. And then we'll add a date, which should be in the format of year-month-day. That will be a date which then later can be parsed and used by the date constructor. So that's some dummy data, and I'll add more than one post here. I'll repeat this 4 times, and I'll just edit the slug slightly. So getting started with Next.js 2 and 3 and 4, so that this is unique. And all the other data is duplicated for the moment, just because I don't want to waste time setting up dummy data here. We'll just need this to see if our grid works correctly. So that is what it is. That is the dummy posts I want to work with, and that's the dummy posts passed to featured posts. Now, in order to see anything on the screen, we now need that image, which we are relying on. And I do provide a dummy image for you. You can use that image, which you find attached, the getting started Next.js PNG file. You can download that and add it in your public images posts folder. There add this getting started Next.js PNG file, which is a little dummy file I created for you. Of course, you can also add your own files. And now double check that the value you set up for the image property here in the dummy posts data is equal to that image file name you just added, that you have no typo here. With that, we should have everything we need. If we now save that, I get an error if I reload because I forgot to set the ref property. Makes sense. In a post item, I'm wrapping the entire post in the end with a link, but I'm not linking anywhere. I forgot to set my ref. And of course, we want to set ref here. Now, what should be the link or the path this link leads to, though? It should, in the end, be the individual page for this selected post. So we want to load this slug page here in the end for that concrete post slug. Hence, here we want to derive that path dynamically, and I'll do that by adding a separate constant, link path, which again is a template literal, where we start with /posts, because that slug file is in the posts folder in the pages folder, and then slash, and then some dynamic value. Here we want to use the slug then, because that slug, that unique human and search engine friendly text, that should be part of the URL. And then it's this link path which we use here. So that is something we have to add. And once we do add this, we do render featured posts. Now the cards are showing up, the image is not though. And that makes sense if we take another look at post item and the image path we're constructing here. I point at images posts and then the slug of the post as an extra subfolder and then the image file name. Now I have the image directly in the posts folder, so that extra slug folder in between is missing. We should add it. We should go back to index.js and then add our slugs here, which we have in the dummy data as subfolders in posts. So I'll add a subfolder with a slug of getting started with Next.js, and I'll drag the image in there. And I'll repeat that for my other dummy posts. Of course, it's always the same image, but still, to be able to render this, I'll add more subfolders in the posts folder. So not inside of the other slug folder, but in the post folder. There I will add more subfolders with those different slug names as folder names, because that is required to find the image correctly. And then we can drag and drop the image by copying it into those other slug subfolders, so that we have the same image 4 times in those different subfolders for those different slugs. Now the image should be fetched correctly. If we save this again and load localhost 3000, we see it. Now what we also see is that here on this big screen, it's a little bit too small. If I open up the DevTools and I resize this, you see it doesn't really fit my card that nicely. It doesn't really fit in there, and that's not the behavior I want. To fix this, we can go back to the post item where we render that image and add the special layout prop. Now I mentioned that we have a couple of values we can set there, and the default is intrinsic, which means the width and height we specify here is the width and height which is being used. Now we want to set this to responsive instead. By setting this, it will fill out the entire surrounding container, this div in this case, which has certain CSS styles that control its width and height, and then it will shrink and grow together with that container. So if we set layout to responsive, now that looks much better. Now we take the full available space as we move this around. Now, of course, it's up to you how exactly that should be styled. I just have some basic starting styles here. You can, of course, fine-tune this to change the size and fine-tune it to your exact requirements. I have some basic styling here, though, and as you see now, that doesn't look too bad. It is growing and shrinking, and we take advantage of this automatically optimized image. So with that, we have our featured posts being rendered here, and therefore the starting page of our blog is finished with that dummy data, but better than nothing. Now we can move on to the other pages and work on those. And I will move on to the posts page now, where I want to render all my posts. So let's continue working on that Next.js file in the posts folder on the all posts page. Here the goal is simple. I want to output all my posts. So later, once we don't just have dummy posts, but an actual data source, we will fetch all posts for this page and then output them in some way here. Now for the actual JSX code, for the detailed HTML structure, I'll again create a separate component to keep my page component lean and focused on data fetching. And therefore in the posts folder, in the components folder, I'll add a all posts.js file. Now attached, you also find a allposts.module.css file, which you should download and add next to that allposts.js file. And then in this allposts.js file, we define our allposts functional component, as we always do, like this. And we can also already import the CSS styles. So import classes from all-posts.module.css, and then work on the JSX code that should be returned here. And I'll keep this all posts page fairly simple. I'll just add a section which gets some styling with classes.posts, and then I'll add a h1 tag for the main title of this page, where I just say all posts. And then I'll again use the posts grid. So we will reuse this component. And therefore, of course, you also need to add this import. Now, I do expect that I get posts through props here from the page, because the page component should be responsible for fetching and preparing the data. And hence, on posts grid, we need to set that posts prop, and I'll just point at props.posts for this. And that is already it. It is a real simple component in the end. Now back on the posts page, on the all posts page, I therefore now want to return the all posts component we just worked on. And for this, of course, also add that import. And now here we again need to prepare the posts that should be used. For the moment, we can again use the dummy posts. So copy that dummy posts array from the starting page, but soon we will add a real data source. For the moment, it's this though. So that's our dummy posts. And then here in all posts, I'll just pass in posts and point at my dummy posts. And with that done, if we save this and click on posts here, we're taken to that page. We got the navigation bar there as well, because we wrapped the layout around all pages, and we got our post grid here. So that is working just as it should, and that's the all posts page finished. Now we got 2 pages left. We got the page for an individual post if we click on it, and we got this contact page. Now we could start with either of the two, but I would say let's start with the post detail page, so that when we click on a post, we load a page and we display the actual post content here. Because that will then also get us closer to setting up an actual data source and to setting up actual posts, which we can then fetch and pre-render and so on. So that's therefore what we'll do next. So let's continue with that post detail page now, with this slug page, which we load for a given slug. On this page, I in the end want to output the content of a selected post. So that includes a header with the title and maybe the image again, but then below that, the actual text that makes up a post. Of course, we don't have any text yet. We only have those excerpts. But in the actual post data, which we'll add in the next lectures, we will also have a rich content for every post with headings and images and maybe code snippets, and of course, a lot of just plain text. Hence, in this Slug.js file, in this component, I again want to return another component which will actually take care about outputting that post content. And I'll do that here in the posts folder, in the components folder. I'll add a subfolder named post detail to make it clear that in there we have the components for a single post. And in there I'll add a post-content.js file. I will also already add a post header.js file, which will be responsible for outputting the main header data, like the main title and the image of that selected post. Now for that, we'll also need some styles, and as always, you find those attached. Attached, you do find a post content module CSS and a post header module CSS file, and you can just download them and add them in your post detail folder. Now let's start with the post content.js file. This will become a quite complex file over time, but we will start simple. We'll again start by creating our component function and exporting that as a default, as we always do. And then in here, we want to return some markup, some JSX code that renders a post. Now later, we will actually get the post content as markdown, which is text with extra annotations. You'll see it in a couple of minutes. And we'll then translate that markdown to React JSX elements. That is something we'll do later. For the moment, I'll start by adding an article element here, a standard article element, and then rendering a post header here as a first element, and then below that, the actual content. And that is what will then later translate from Markdown to actual JSX code. Now let's start with the post header though, with that post header component, for which we have this separate post header.js file. In there, again, we create our component function as we always did, and we export post header here. And then here we can return a header element, let's say, with a h1 element with the title of the post. And I do expect that I get data like the title from props. So here I do expect that I can pull data out of my props and that I get the title here and actually also the image. So then here I just output the title like that. And then below that, I want to render an image. And I'll again do that with the image component, which we therefore import from next image. So we import that component and render it just like that below the h1 tag. Actually, because of the styling, which we'll add soon, it will be rendered next to the h1 tag. So now we got that. Now the source of the image element here should be the image we're getting as an argument. And here I will expect that image is the full path to the image already. So I'll just set source equal to image, set alt equal to the title. And then we need values for width and height. And here a width of 200 and a height of 150 should work quite well. Now we will need some styles, so I'll import classes from /post-header.module.css, this CSS file which I provided to you. And with that on the header, we can add a class name of header, like that. Now that is the post header component which we use in post content. Hence we need to set the title and the image here. Now speaking of that, our post content will need some content to work. And we'll soon get that content from a real data source. Since we don't have that data source yet, I'll create a dummy post here, and we will just assume that we loaded that post. So I'll create a dummy post here, which is a JavaScript object, which will contain some dummy data, like for example a slug. And here I want to use one of the slugs I used before. Actually, I'll grab one of my dummy posts here, so a single dummy post. I'll grab that post and use that now as a dummy post in post content. Here, like this. I will get rid of the exert though, we don't need that here, but instead I will add a content field which will contain the actual post content. And in here I will write markdown code. Now in case you're not familiar with markdown, you can of course Google it, look it up, and you'll see that there also is a cheat sheet. Markdown in the end is plain text with extra annotations. Markdown looks like this. You write text, and you can, for example, add a hash symbol in front of it to turn it into a title. You can also create lists with dashes or with numbers to have ordered lists. You can add links by putting text in square brackets and adding the link destination in parentheses thereafter, things like that. If you ever worked with GitHub and you added a README for a GitHub repository, you wrote that in Markdown. And we use Markdown here because it's less code than if we would use HTML, and it can be translated into HTML or into JSX even with third-party packages which we'll add. So here I'll add a simple Markdown text of this is a first post. And the interesting thing is that this is plain text with this extra hash annotation, turning this into a title in Markdown's world. And the goal is now to translate this string from Markdown into JSX, which we'll do in the next lecture. Before we do that, let's set the title and image of the post header though. For this, here in post content, I will create an image path here, and again set up a template literal, where we dive into /images/posts, then use the slug, so dummypost.slug, and then use the actual image name, so inject dummypost.image. And it's this image path which I set as a value for the image prop on my post header, like this. And for the title, we can also set this dynamically to dummypost.title. Now for the content, we don't want to do dummypost.content Because if we would see that content, but we would just output it as plain text, not translated from Markdown to JSX. And therefore, that's not what we want. Still, to get started, let's start with this. And let's then go to the slug.js file in the pages post folder and output post content here. And later, we'll pass in the data for the post content from inside this page. For the moment, I'll just render it like this, and I'll import post content from the proper path, therefore. And if we do all that, if you reload a single post, you see post header is not defined, because in post content, I'm using post header, but I'm not importing it. That's something we should change. I'll import post header from /post header, add that import in the post content file, and now we see this. This is not the final look I want though. I want some extra styling, and for that I did add that post content module CSS file. So I will also import classes from there and import classes from post-content.module.css. And then on this article here, set a class name of classes.content. If we save that now, that looks better. But here we see that we have this untransformed raw text. And therefore, let's now become a bit more advanced by adding functionality to translate plain Markdown text into renderable JSX code. So it's time to convert that Markdown. And for that, we'll install a third-party package. So I'll quit my development server and npm install a new package which will help us with that. And that package is the React-Markdown package. This package takes Markdown and outputs it as JSX. So we need to install that package. And once that's done, we can restart the development server. And in the post content.js file, import React Markdown with a capital R at the beginning, because this will act as a component from React Markdown. So we import the React Markdown component from that React Markdown package we just installed. Now, if we go down here, what we can do is instead of outputting our content like this, we output React Markdown, this component here, and between the opening and closing tags, we pass our content, just like this. If we do that, you'll notice something interesting. If we reload, this now changed its style, the hash is gone, and if we inspect this, it's rendered as a h1 tag. So it was translated to a title. So this Markdown to JSX translation works simply by adding this component, which is of course awesome and really makes our life easier. Now we're going to come back to this component later when it comes to rendering inline images, so images as part of our posts, and when it comes to rendering code snippets, because there we'll then tweak it a little bit. But for the moment, it just works. And therefore, as a next step, before we tweak this anymore and before we dive deeper into that, let's now replace all that dummy content with some actual content. Because we got all the building blocks now, we got the core pages, we understand that we plan to use Markdown, and therefore we're now ready to take the next step, add a real data source, then load data from that source, and then render that data. So it's time to move away from those dummy posts. That of course brings up one question. Where do we want to store our actual posts? And one pretty obvious choice would be a database. Something like Firebase or MongoDB or a SQL database. And there is nothing wrong with that. We could do that. But for a blog like this, which is owned by us, where we write those blog posts, there also is another very nice solution. We could use our file system as a data source because we don't need to write to our blog posts. I mean, we have to write them at some point, but then once they're done, they are a data source from which we only fetch data. We only use them to load blog posts. Users on the website can't interact with them to change them. So once they exist, we might occasionally update, but whenever we do that, we as a owner dive directly into those blog posts, but the files themselves are then only fetched by our application. So if we use our local file system here, our project folder, we don't have to set up an extra database and pay for it. We don't have to do all that wire up work. And that can be pretty nice. And therefore, a quite common approach is to add a new folder in your project folder, which could be named content. But that name is totally up to you. It doesn't have to be named content. And in there, we could have a subfolder named posts if we would have different kinds of content. Or if we don't have that, we get rid of that folder. And instead of a content posts folder, we just directly add a posts folder in the project. Now, the idea is that in that posts folder, we store our posts. And what do I mean with store our posts? Well, keep in mind that we will write our posts with Markdown, so with that Markdown syntax. Hence, I'll add a new file in there, let's say the getting-started-with-next.js.md file. MD stands for Markdown. So this is a Markdown file which I added here. And in there, we can write Markdown code. You can also install extra extensions that help you with writing Markdown code. In Visual Studio Code, if you search for Markdown, there you can install extra support, but I don't even have that. I'm happy to write it like this. Now in here, we can write that Markdown code like this is a title. This is some regular text with a link. That is something we could write here as content. However, if you take a closer look at our pages and our different components, you might see that just content is not enough. We also rely on an excerpt and a date and a title and an image for outputting all our posts. So we need to add metadata to our posts. And the great thing about Markdown is that you can easily combine it with a concept called gray matter, which is just metadata you add to your Markdown file. You add that by adding 3 dashes, opening and closing, so to say, above your content. So here we have 3 dashes, and between those 3 dash separators, we can add our metadata for this Markdown file as key value pairs, basically, in YAML format, to be precise. And you can look up YAML format to see what's allowed in here. For example, we can set a title here to "This is the post title," or in this case, probably "Getting started with Next.js." We can add a date, which could be 2022-10-15. And we can also wrap that in quotes to make it clear that that's a string. It's technically not always required, but can be required sometimes if YAML is not able to find out which data type it is otherwise. Here you could also add an author if you need that. I don't have it in this blog, since it's only my blog and I'm the only author of all those posts, but you could add an author field here as well, and then fetch and render that later. Now what we'll need is an image though. We will definitely need that. And here I'll just have my getting-started next.js.png image file here. So this image file which I added in the images posts folder before. And as a side note, to connect everything correctly and use the already existing structure in the public images folder, you should make sure that your posts markdown file has a file name that matches one of the folder names in that posts folder in the images folder. Because we'll then later connect all that data such that we fetch the image we specify here from an equally named folder in the public images posts folder. So you should make sure that this is equal. Then here we can also add an exert, and I'll just quickly grab my dummy exert here, which I wrote down before from the index.js file, and add that as an exert here. I didn't add a line break here. That's just my IDE, which is kind of showing a line break. It's one long inline text. And I will now also add a isFeatured key here and set this to true. So Boolean values are also allowed here. We will then later use that for selecting just the featured posts for the starting page. So that's now extra metadata, and that's the actual post content. And we can write files like this, and we can also fetch data from such files and split it in metadata and content. All of that is possible with ease. And therefore, that will be our data source here. So now with that, I'll save that markdown file. And I will now also get rid of the other dummy post folders in the images folder and just keep one of those folders around for that markdown file we just added. And now the goal is to kind of use our posts folder as a data source to generate all required single post files based on the number of post files in the posts folder, to load the featured posts from there, so to go through all the posts and select the featured posts for the starting page, and to load all the posts for the all posts page. And that's what we're going to do in the next lecture. So now we want to use our markdown files in the posts folder as a data source. For example, for the starting page here, instead of using dummy posts, we want to fetch our posts from that post folder. For example, with help of getStaticProps. Now, before we do that, I'll first of all create a new folder in the project though, a lib folder, or helpers folder, whatever you want to call it. And in there, I'll add posts-util.js file. This simply is a file which will have extra utility functionality for fetching my post data and for extracting metadata from those markdown files. And speaking of that, for this we need to install another extra package. So quit your running development server and install an extra package with npm install, and that would be the gray-matter package. That's a package which allows us to read a markdown file and split it into metadata and the actual markdown content. Once that's installed, we can start the development server again. And now in posts-util.js, I want to add a couple of functions that fetch us all posts, all featured posts, and then also a single post. Now let's maybe start with all posts. Let's add a getAllPosts function here. The idea here is that we take a look at this posts folder with the markdown files and simply check how many markdown files we have there, and then go through all those markdown files to get the metadata for all those files. Now for going through all those files here, I will work with the file system, and hence we should import fs from fs. So import this fs node module. And then here in getAllPosts, I'll start by reading all the content from a directory with the fs module and the readDir-sync method. readDir-sync will read all the content synchronously, so in a blocking way, which is fine here because I want to parse all posts anyways before I do anything else. So I'll read the entire content of a directory in one go here. Now we need to pass a path to the directory to readDir-sync, and I'll create this as a separate constant outside of all those functions here. I'll name it posts directory, though of course the name is up to you. And then here I'll import another thing from Node.js. I'll import the path module here. This allows me to construct an absolute path with the join method. And here I join process.current working directory, executed as a method, which will point at the overall project folder, as you learned, not at this lib folder, but at the overall project folder. So that is then an absolute path to the overall project folder. And then I'll add posts as an extra folder into which it should dive. So this posts folder here. That's then an absolute path to my posts directory, and that's the directory I want to read. So that's what I pass to read_dir sync. Now this will return an array of strings, as you see. In the end, it will be an array of file names. So here I have my post files, which I load with read_dir sync. As a next step, I now want to go through all those post files and dive into them to extract metadata and markdown content. I also want to derive a slug, which can be put in the URL from the file name. So basically, I want to use the file name without the extension, which still is part inside of post files at the moment. Now for this, I'll add an extra helper function, getPostData, sounds like a fitting name. And here I expect to get the file name as an argument. Now in getPostData, we want to read the content of a file. We can again do that with the fs module, and there we have that readFileSync method for reading the content of a file. Here we need the file name, but not just the file name, we still need the full path to that file. So I'll construct my file path here by again using path.join, and I'll join this posts directory path, which we already have, with that file name. So that constructs a full absolute path to that concrete file. Now we can use this file path for reading the content of that file. We can also add a second argument here and make it clear that the file encoding is UTF-8, so that we support all those Unicode characters. Then we got the file content here. That's what readFileSync produces. Now we're doing this for a single file here, so I'm not doing this in a loop or anything like this. I'm just doing this for one file. We're going to call getPostData in a loop for all files later though. But here we then have the content of a single file, and now we know that in a single file we have this metadata and the actual content. Now the overall content is what Node.js extracted for us. To split it up, we'll use this gray matter package which we installed. So for this, I'll import matter from gray-matter like this. And matter is simply a function which we can call here, to which we pass a string. And our file content is just a string. It's the content of a file as text. So we pass the file content to matter, and matter will then return an object with two properties. With a data property for the metadata, so a data property which contains the metadata as a JavaScript object, and a content property which contains the actual content, the markdown text, as a string. So we can use object destructuring to pull these two properties out of the returned object and store them in separate constants, data and content. And these names are not up to you. These are the properties in that object created by matter, so by this matter function. Now that we got that, we can prepare our own post data object, which should contain all that metadata and that content, but also contain an extra slug field with the slug, so with the file name without the file extension. For this, I'll first of all create my post slug here, and we can easily create this by using our file name and simply replacing the file extension with nothing. We could use a regular expression here to select the markdown extension with this regular expression and replace it with an empty string. So this removes the file extension in the end. That leaves us with a slug, which is just the file name without the extension. And therefore, of course, you should make sure that your file names do have this slug format and do not contain any special characters or white space. And once that's done, we can prepare that post data which we return. Here I want to add a slug field and store my created post slug. I will then also spread my data in there. So the data we extracted from the markdown file, and I'll add a content field and point at the content extracted from markdown. And of course, here we can use the shortcut. So that's now an object containing the data for a single post read from that markdown file. And that's what I want to return here in getPostData. Okay, so now we have that getPostData function. We have getAllPosts where we get all those files. Now we want to call getPostData for every post we got here in getAllPosts. So there we can, of course, just create a for loop to go through all the post files we have here, like this, for example. And for every file, we want to call getPostData and pass the post file, so the file name in the end, to getPostData. And since in there we use read file sync, we will block the further loop execution until we parse that data. And that will be super fast, no worries. So that will not take long. It will be milliseconds. So then here we get our post data like this for a given post. And overall, we now want to create an array of post data pieces. So an array of such post objects. And therefore, we can actually also change this a little bit. In the end, what we want to do is we want to map our array of post files into an array of post data objects. So we could also just use post files and call map to execute some logic on every post file, and in the end, just return get post data for the given post file. So then we would map our array of file names into an array of objects with the actual data for those different posts. And I think that makes more sense. Now map returns a new array. It does not change the existing array, so I will create a new all posts array, which is an array full of post data. Now maybe we also want to sort that so that we have the latest posts first, and hence I'll call all posts sort here to sort my posts. And I'll add my own sorting function here where we get post A and post B. And in the end, we want to now check if post A.date is greater than post B.date. And if that's the case, return -1, otherwise return 1. That's the default JavaScript sort method, which will make sure that posts with a greater date, so more recent posts, are actually sorted in front of older posts. That also returns a new array, the sorted posts array, and that's now what I'll return here inside of this getAllPosts function. Now that was a lot of work, but I hopefully could make it clear what happens. But with that, we have the getAllPosts function, which reads all the posts in the posts folder, no matter if that's one or multiple posts, and then gets all the data for those posts and also sorts them and then returns them. Now to finish up the work on this file, I now just want to add one other function which is responsible for getting all the featured posts. So I'll name it getFeaturedPosts. And here, I'll first of all get all posts again by calling getAllPosts. So that's simple. And then I'll just find out what my featured posts are by taking all posts and filtering them by calling filter on them. So here I'll then look at every single post and simply check if post is featured, if that's true. If it's true, we'll keep it. If it's false, we'll drop it. So featured posts then only contains the posts where is featured is set to true. And then I'll return this here. That means that we still go through all posts first, but we'll have to do it anyways. We'll have to look into every file anyways to find out whether it's featured or not. If you don't want to do that, you would have to keep an extra data source around, something like a JSON file, which holds the slugs of all the featured posts. And then you would just read those and then just pull the specific markdown files, which this extra JSON file points at. That could be an alternative for a bigger blog with hundreds or thousands of posts to increase the build performance a little bit. But for this blog, this approach is absolutely fine. So now we got all of this, and now as a last step, I'll export the get featured posts and the get all posts functions because we will need those to fetch that data.